The metallic snap of powerful jaws echoed through the air as a massive Rottweiler lunged forward, missing Sergeant David Okafor's throat by mere inches. The prestigious Ceremonial Guard stood unflinching, his dark skin contrasting sharply with the brilliant scarlet of his ceremonial uniform, sunlight glinting off the polished brass buttons that lined his chest. Maxwell Andrews, a middle-aged man with cold eyes and an expensive bespoke suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, yanked the dog's chain harder, sneering as he spat out words dripping with venom. "Show him what real Canadian strength looks like, Zeus," he growled, his face contorted with a hatred that seemed to have been festering for years. The gathering crowd gasped and backed away, phones raised to capture the unfolding drama, but something changed in David's eyes as the dog charged again. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The kind that comes from years of handling military K-9 units in Afghanistan's most dangerous provinces. In one fluid motion, the guard sidestepped the attack, his hand moving with surgical precision, every movement reflecting countless hours of training and real-world experience. Before anyone could blink, the snarling Rottweiler was sitting obediently at David's feet, its aggressive demeanor completely transformed, leaving Maxwell staring in slack-jawed disbelief. "You made 3 mistakes today," David said calmly, his voice carrying the weight of authority that could only come from years of command. "First, assuming I was just another ceremonial guard. Second, not recognizing a former K-9 commander. And third, thinking hate makes you strong." 3 hours earlier, the crisp autumn morning had bathed Ottawa's magnificent Parliament building in golden light, the Gothic architecture casting dramatic shadows across the perfectly maintained grounds. Tourists gathered with cameras, their excited chatter mixing with the rustle of falling maple leaves, the October air carrying the first hint of the approaching winter. No one expected the events that would unfold on this morning, least of all the dozens of visitors who had come to witness the changing of the guard, a ceremony that had become one of Ottawa's most beloved traditions. What began as a routine day for Sergeant David Okafor would become a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought on military battlefields. They're fought right here at home, on the very grounds meant to represent democracy and equality. Sergeant David Okafor, 35 and Nigerian Canadian, stood at attention, his ceremonial uniform immaculate, every movement precise and measured, just as it had been during his years of military service. The bearskin cap sat perfectly aligned on his head, its weight familiar after countless hours of duty. Unlike many of his colleagues, he brought unique experience to his role in Canada's elite ceremonial guard. After 3 tours with the Canadian Special Forces and specialized work with military K-9 units in some of the world's most dangerous regions, standing guard should have felt simple. But something about today felt different, a subtle tension in the air that his military training couldn't ignore, the same kind of sixth sense that had saved his life more than once in the field. The morning crowd moved around him in waves, tourists from every corner of the globe taking pictures and pointing out the architectural details of the Parliament building. A group of school children on a field trip passed by, their teacher explaining the significance of the ceremonial guard in hushed, respectful tones. An elderly woman, her silver hair neatly styled and her walking cane gripped firmly in her weathered hands, approached with purpose in her step. Her eyes were bright with admiration as she looked up at David. "Thank you for your service," she said softly, her voice carrying the slight tremor of age but unwavering in its sincerity. "My grandson wants to join the military someday. He'd be proud to serve alongside men like you." David maintained his ceremonial stance but acknowledged her with a slight nod, permitted within protocol. These were the moments that reminded him why he chose to serve after immigrating to Canada as a child, why he believed in protecting the traditions and values of his adopted home. The woman's genuine warmth represented everything he loved about his country, its openness, its respect for service, its ability to embrace people from all walks of life. But at the edge of the crowd, a different scene unfolded, one that represented the darker currents that sometimes ran beneath Canada's welcoming surface. Maxwell Andrews, a man whose expensive suit and bearing screamed old money, stood with his Rottweiler Zeus watching David with unconcealed contempt. His presence carried the weight of privilege and prejudice, a stark contrast to the tourist's warmth. The dog, a magnificent specimen of its breed, stood tensely at his side, reflecting its owner's barely contained hostility. "Look what they've done to our traditions," Maxwell muttered to his companion, James Porter, who shifted uncomfortably beside him, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "My father served in the Ceremonial Guard when it meant something, when it truly represented Canadian values." His voice dripped with implications that made his meaning clear to anyone within earshot. "Max, maybe we should," James started, his discomfort evident in his nervous glances between his friend and the gathering crowd, but Maxwell cut him off sharply. It's time someone made a statement. These people need to understand that some traditions shouldn't be changed. The words hung in the air like a threat, and David noticed the exchange, his training alerting him to the underlying tension. He'd faced prejudice before, both in the military and civilian life, but something about Maxwell's demeanor set off warning bells honed by years of combat experience. It was the same kind of tension he'd felt before ambushes in Afghanistan, the calm before the storm. As the morning progressed, Maxwell remained, his dog growing increasingly agitated, picking up on its owner's mounting tension. Other guards noticed too, subtle glances exchanged between them. An unspoken communication developed through months of working together. They'd dealt with protesters and troublemakers before, but this felt different. Personal. The tourists continued their visits, but the atmosphere had shifted, like the air before a thunderstorm. What no one knew then was that this wasn't just another day of ceremonial duty. It was about to become a test of everything Sergeant Okafor had learned in his years of service, and a powerful reminder that true strength comes not from hatred, but from dignity in the face of it. The tension built as the morning sun climbed higher, and Maxwell Andrews began to move closer, his Rottweiler's leash gripped tight in his manicured hands, knuckles white with tension. The air grew thick with anticipation, and tourists began to notice the brewing confrontation, their cameras lowering as they sensed the shift in atmosphere. David remained stoic, his posture perfect, but his mind raced through years of training and experience preparing for whatever might come next. In his peripheral vision, he could see other guards subtly adjusting their positions, ready to respond if needed. The weight of his ceremonial uniform seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, but his resolve remained unshaken. He had faced down insurgents in war-torn countries. He could face whatever this man had planned. Maxwell Andrews wasn't always a man consumed by hatred. 20 years ago, he had inherited his father's position on the board of one of Canada's largest investment firms, along with the weight of generations of expectations. His father, Colonel Richard Andrews, had served in the Ceremonial Guard during what he called the golden years, when tradition meant everything, and change was viewed with suspicion. Growing up, Maxwell had been force-fed stories of military glory and cultural purity, each tale reinforcing the idea that some people belonged and others didn't. Now, watching David stand guard at the Parliament building, all those years of inherited prejudice bubbled to the surface like poison from an old wound. Zeus pulled against his leash again, sensing his master's growing agitation. The Rottweiler had been extensively trained, or rather, extensively corrupted, to respond to certain triggers. Maxwell had paid a small fortune to a questionable trainer who specialized in creating protection dogs for wealthy clients with specific preferences. The trainer had never asked why Maxwell wanted his dog to react aggressively to people of certain backgrounds. Money had a way of preventing uncomfortable questions. James Porter watched his childhood friend with growing concern. He'd known Maxwell since their prep school days, had witnessed his gradual transformation from a privileged but relatively harmless young man into someone consumed by bitterness. "Max," he tried again, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder. "Think about what you're doing. This isn't worth throwing everything away." Maxwell shrugged off the hand, his eyes never leaving David's stoic figure. "You don't understand, James. This is about more than one guard. This is about sending a message. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning crowd continued to mill about, unaware of the darkness brewing at its edges. A young couple posed for selfies with the Parliament building in the background, their laughter carrying across the courtyard. A tour guide led a group of international students past David's post, explaining the history of the Ceremonial Guard in careful, accented English. The Guard represents the finest traditions of Canadian military service, the guide said, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. They undergo extensive training and must maintain the highest standards of discipline and professionalism. David heard the guide's words and felt their truth in his bones. His journey to this position had been anything but traditional. Born in Lagos, Nigeria, he had immigrated to Canada with his parents at the age of 10, carrying little more than hope and determination. His father, a university professor, had taught him that education and service were the twin pillars of a meaningful life. Those lessons had led him first to the military, then to the Special Forces, and finally to the K-9 unit, where he had found his true calling. In Afghanistan, David had worked with some of the finest military dogs in the world. He learned to read their body language, to understand the subtle signals that could mean the difference between life and death in the field. His unit had been responsible for detecting IEDs and preventing ambushes, saving countless lives through their careful partnership with their trained companions. The dogs had taught him patience, respect, and the understanding that aggression usually stemmed from fear or poor training, rather than inherent nature. As Maxwell edged closer through the crowd, David's trained eye caught every detail. The way Zeus's ears were positioned, the tension in his muscles, the subtle signs of aggressive training that had warped what should have been a noble and protective animal into a weapon. It reminded him of a similar situation in Kandahar, where a local warlord had trained dogs to attack specific targets. David had helped rehabilitate those dogs, showing them that there was another way to live, another way to be. More tourists gathered, their phones raised to capture photos of the impressive guard in his ceremonial uniform. A young girl pointed at David's bearskin cap, asking her mother how he managed to stand so still. The mother smiled, explaining that it took great discipline and training. The ordinary scene carried on, but beneath it, tension continued to build like a pressure cooker about to explode. James made one last attempt to prevent what he could see coming. Maxwell, think about your position at the firm. Think about your father's legacy. Is this really how you want to honor it? But Maxwell's face had hardened into a mask of determination. My father's legacy, he spat. Look around, James. Look what they've done to it. Someone needs to take a stand. Someone needs to remind them of their place. David remained motionless, but his mind was racing through scenarios, evaluating threats and planning responses just as he had done countless times in combat. His peripheral vision tracked Maxwell's movement while maintaining his ceremonial stance. Years of military training had taught him to appear completely still while remaining ready to react in a split second. He could feel the weight of his uniform, heavy with tradition and responsibility. But it was a weight he had earned the right to bear. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting shorter shadows across the Parliament grounds. A light breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves and the distant sound of traffic. To the casual observer, it was just another beautiful morning in Ottawa. But to those who knew what to look for, those who had seen conflict up close, the signs of imminent confrontation were as clear as signal flares in a dark sky. The peace of the morning was about to be shattered, and when it broke, David knew he would need every ounce of his training and experience to handle what was coming. The first signs of trouble rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Several tourists backed away instinctively as Maxwell began to move forward, Zeus's low growl carrying across the courtyard. The other ceremonial guards noticed too, their seemingly vacant stares now focused with laser precision on the unfolding situation. Sergeant Sarah Chen, positioned at the corner of the building, subtly touched her radio, alerting security to a potential situation. She had worked with David long enough to trust his judgment, and something in his stance told her to be ready. David's mind flashed back to his last deployment in Afghanistan, where he had faced a similar situation with potentially deadly consequences. His unit had been conducting a routine patrol in a small village outside Kandahar when they encountered a local warlord who used trained attack dogs to maintain control over the population. The parallels were striking: the same calculated use of animals as weapons, the same hatred masked as authority. That situation had ended without bloodshed, thanks to David's expertise with handling aggressive dogs. He hoped this morning would end the same way. Maxwell's expensive leather shoes clicked against the stone pavement as he approached, each step deliberate and measured. Zeus padded alongside him, muscled body tense and ready to spring. The morning sun caught the dog's coat, highlighting the powerful build that made Rottweilers such impressive animals when properly trained, and such dangerous weapons when abused. "You know," Maxwell called out, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of someone used to commanding boardrooms. "My father always said the Guard was the last bastion of true Canadian values. He'd be disappointed to see what it's become." Around them, the crowd's reaction split like a fracturing mirror. Some tourists hurriedly moved away, sensing the dangerous undercurrent in Maxwell's words. Others raised their phones higher, eager to capture whatever drama was about to unfold. A few older visitors shook their heads in disgust, recognizing the ugly prejudice in Maxwell's stance. One elderly gentleman wearing a veteran's pin on his jacket stepped forward as if to intervene, but his wife gently pulled him back, whispering, "Let the Guard handle it." James Porter had retreated to the edge of the gathering crowd, his face a mask of shame and confusion. He pulled out his phone, fingers hovering over the keypad, torn between loyalty to his oldest friend and the knowledge that what was about to happen was terribly wrong. In the end, he began dialing the police, turning away as if the simple act of not watching would somehow absolve him of responsibility. David remained motionless, but his training had kicked into high gear. He cataloged every detail. The way Maxwell's right hand gripped the leash too tightly, the subtle signs of Zeus's trained aggression, the positions of nearby civilians who might be at risk. His ceremonial uniform might seem restrictive, but years of practice had taught him how to move efficiently despite the formal attire. Every muscle was ready, though his face remained impassive. "Did you hear me?" Maxwell's voice took on a harder edge as he moved closer, now just 15 feet away. "I'm talking to you, or don't they teach respect anymore?" Zeus's growl deepened, the sound reverberating off the Parliament building's stone walls. A young mother hurriedly pulled her children back, her face tight with concern. The autumn breeze carried the scent of the dog's aggression, a sharp, acrid smell that David recognized from his military days. Sarah Chen's voice crackled quietly over the Guard's earpieces. "Security is 2 minutes out." "Hold positions," David acknowledged with an almost imperceptible blink, knowing his colleagues would understand. 2 minutes could be an eternity in a situation like this, but they were trained for exactly these scenarios. The key was to contain the threat without escalating the situation. Maxwell's next words dripped with generations of inherited privilege and prejudice. "You people come here, put on our uniforms, stand in front of our buildings, but you don't understand our traditions. You don't respect what this all means." He was close enough now that David could see the slight tremor in his hands, the wild look in his eyes that spoke of something deeper than simple racism. A fear of change, of losing grip on a world that was evolving beyond his control. Zeus's ears were fully erect now, his body coiled like a spring. David knew the signs. The dog had been trained to react to specific triggers, probably certain tones of voice or gestures. It was a perversion of proper K9 training, using an animal's loyalty to channel human hatred. In Afghanistan, David had rehabilitated dogs like this, helping them unlearn their aggressive conditioning. But that had taken time and patience, luxuries he might not have this morning. Through it all, David maintained his ceremonial stance, but his mind was racing through scenarios. He tracked the position of every civilian in his field of vision, noted the locations of his fellow guards, calculated angles and distances. His ceremonial sword, though mainly decorative, could serve as a defensive tool if absolutely necessary. But his greatest weapon was his experience. Years of handling military dogs had taught him how to defuse aggression without violence. The tension in the air had reached a breaking point. Tourists had formed a loose circle around the scene, their cameras capturing every moment. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard, creating a dramatic backdrop that seemed to underscore the gravity of the situation. In the distance, birds continued their autumn songs, oblivious to the human drama unfolding below. Security was on their way, but David knew the next few moments would determine how this situation ended. And based on the look in Maxwell's eyes, those moments were rapidly running out. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion, like a sequence from a carefully choreographed dance where every participant knew their role except for the audience. Maxwell's face contorted with a sudden surge of rage, his carefully maintained facade of civilized superiority cracking under the weight of David's continued stoicism. "You think you can just ignore me?" he snarled, his voice rising to carry across the courtyard. "Let's see how well you maintain that stance when Zeus shows you some real Canadian discipline." The Rottweiler's muscles bunched beneath its glossy coat, responding to subtle cues in its owner's voice and posture that spoke of imminent violence. David had seen this exact behavior during his military service, the moment when a trained attack dog shifts from intimidation to action. In Afghanistan, he'd learned that these transitions happened in milliseconds, requiring split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. Sarah Chen's voice crackled again in David's earpiece, tension evident despite her professional tone. "Security delayed at main gate, 3 more minutes minimum." The message was clear. Whatever was about to happen, the ceremonial guards would have to handle it themselves. David caught a subtle shift in his colleagues' positions as they prepared for potential intervention, their ceremonial stillness masking combat-ready alertness. The crowd had grown larger now, drawn by the building tension. Phones recorded from every angle, their owners perhaps not fully grasping the danger of the situation. A young boy, no more than 7, tried to push forward for a better view, but his father quickly pulled him back, recognizing the deadly serious nature of what was unfolding. The autumn wind carried scattered leaves across the courtyard, nature's own commentary on the swirling tension. James Porter's voice cut through the murmuring crowd, a final attempt to prevent disaster. "Max, the police are on their way. Think about what you're doing." But his words seemed to have the opposite effect, pushing Maxwell past his last thread of restraint. Years of privilege and prejudice, combined with the public nature of the confrontation, had created a perfect storm of rage and wounded pride. David's mind raced through his options, each scenario playing out in tactical detail. His ceremonial uniform, though restrictive, wouldn't handicap him significantly. He had trained extensively in full gear during his military service. The real challenge would be protecting the civilians while neutralizing both dog and master without causing lasting harm to either. In Afghanistan, he had learned that rehabilitating an attack dog began in the moment of confrontation. How you handled the initial engagement could determine whether the animal could ever be retrained. Maxwell's grip on the leash tightened, his knuckles white with tension. "You see this dog?" he spat, moving a step closer. "He's been trained by the best. Expensive German bloodlines, specialized training, the kind of pedigree that means something." The irony of his words, using a German dog to defend what he called Canadian values, might have been amusing in a different situation. Now it just highlighted the confused nature of his hatred. Zeus's growl deepened, responding to his master's escalating anger. David could read the dog's body language like a book. The slightly pulled-back lips, the forward-set ears, the tensed hindquarters. The animal had been trained to attack on command, its natural protective instincts perverted into a weapon of hatred. In different circumstances, under proper training, this same dog could have been a loyal guardian, a protector of the innocent rather than a tool of intimidation. The morning sun had risen higher, its rays catching the brass buttons on David's uniform, creating tiny points of light that seemed to emphasize the gravity of the moment. A tour group at the far end of the courtyard had stopped to watch, their guide's rehearsed speech about parliamentary history forgotten in the face of unfolding drama. Among them, an older man with military bearing reached for his phone, his movements suggesting he recognized the dangerous situation developing. "Last chance," Maxwell announced, his voice carrying the strange calm of someone who had passed the point of reason. "Step down from that post. Show some respect to your betters." The demand was absurd. A civilian attempting to order a ceremonial guard to abandon his post, but the threat behind it was deadly serious. David knew from experience that the most dangerous moments often came wrapped in illogical demands, the kind that couldn't be met even if you wanted to. Sarah Chen's voice came through again, tense but controlled. "David, whatever you're going to do, be ready. We've got your back." The support of his fellow guards was unspoken but palpable, each of them prepared to move the moment the situation required it. They had trained together, worked together, faced countless challenges together. This would be no different, except for the very public nature of the confrontation. Maxwell's next words were practically a whisper, but they carried clearly in the tense atmosphere. "Have it your way, then." His grip on the leash shifted subtly, and David knew what was coming next. Years of military experience, countless hours of K-9 training, and the weight of his current responsibility all condensed into this moment. The next few seconds would determine not just the outcome of this confrontation, but perhaps something larger, a statement about dignity in the face of hatred, about standing one's ground without descending to the level of the aggressor. Everything happened at once. Maxwell's hand released the tension on the leash, giving Zeus the slack he needed to attack. The Rottweiler launched forward with explosive power, its specialized training evident in the precision of its movement. The crowd gasped collectively, several people screaming as they scrambled backward, creating a chaotic ripple of motion across the courtyard. But David was already moving, his years of military training taking over with fluid precision. Time seemed to slow down as David's combat instincts kicked in. He could see everything with crystal clarity, the trajectory of Zeus's leap, the look of savage satisfaction on Maxwell's face, the positions of nearby civilians, the subtle movements of his fellow guards preparing to intervene. The weight of his ceremonial uniform felt familiar now, like the combat gear he'd worn in countless operations overseas. This was different terrain, but the principles remained the same. Protect civilians, neutralize the threat, minimize harm. Zeus's initial lunge was textbook attack dog form, aimed high, going for the throat or face, designed to disable the target quickly. It was exactly the kind of approach David had trained military dogs to counter during his years in the K-9 unit. As the dog's powerful jaws snapped shut where his throat had been moments before, David had already executed a precise sidestep, his movement so smooth, it almost appeared choreographed. The crowd's collective gasp turned to murmurs of amazement. Maxwell's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to confusion as he watched his carefully trained weapon miss its target. "Get him!" he shouted, his voice cracking with rage and disbelief. Zeus wheeled around for another attack, but David was already implementing the next phase of his response. His hand moved with practiced efficiency, catching the trailing leash in a specific grip he had used countless times in Afghanistan when dealing with aggressive military dogs that had gone off protocol. The next few seconds demonstrated why David's reputation in the military K-9 unit had been legendary. As Zeus launched his second attack, David executed a series of precise movements that looked deceptively simple to observers, but represented years of specialized training. His grip on the leash adjusted subtly, his body position shifted by mere inches, and his voice cut through the chaos with a command that carried the full weight of military authority. "Down!" The command rang out across the courtyard, delivered in the exact tone and pitch that military dogs were trained to respond to. Zeus's forward momentum hesitated for a fraction of a second, his ingrained attack training warring with the deeply embedded instinct to respond to authoritative commands. That momentary hesitation was all David needed. With a subtle movement that seemed to defy physics, he redirected the dog's energy, using principles of K-9 handling that most civilian trainers never learned. The crowd watched in astonishment as the snarling Rottweiler transformed before their eyes. Zeus's aggressive posture melted away, replaced by the attentive stance of a well-trained military dog. David maintained eye contact with the animal, his presence projecting the calm authority that had made him so effective in working with military K9 units. The dog's tail, which had been rigid with aggression moments before, dropped to a neutral position. What are you doing to my dog?" Maxwell's voice cracked, his carefully constructed facade of superiority crumbling as he watched his weapon of hatred transform into an obedient canine under David's expert handling. He yanked at the leash, trying to reassert control, but David's grip remained firm, his movements calculated to protect both the dog and the surrounding civilians. Sarah Chen's voice came through David's earpiece. "Security approaching from the east entrance. 30 seconds. But David's focus remained on the immediate situation. He could see other ceremonial guards maintaining their positions, but ready to move if needed, their training allowing them to read the situation perfectly. The crowd had formed a wide circle around the scene, phones recording every moment of this unexpected demonstration of skill and restraint. "You don't know what you're dealing with," David said calmly, his voice carrying across the now silent courtyard. "This dog was trained for military-grade response, but you purchased black market conditioning, didn't you? Had him trained to respond to hate instead of purpose." His words were measured, each one chosen carefully to establish his expertise while maintaining control of the situation. Zeus sat calmly now, responding to subtle cues in David's body language that spoke to years of professional K9 handling. Maxwell's face contorted with a mix of rage and disbelief. "You can't. This isn't," he sputtered, his carefully maintained image of superiority dissolving in the face of David's obvious mastery. The expensive suit and privileged bearing seemed to shrink, revealing the smallness of the man beneath. Around them, the crowd had grown larger, drawn by the dramatic confrontation and its unexpected turn. Phones captured every moment, preserving the scene where hatred and prejudice were dismantled, not with violence but with skill and composure. The autumn sun caught the brass buttons of David's ceremonial uniform as security personnel finally arrived, their approach careful and measured as they assessed the situation. James Porter had moved forward, his phone still in hand, ready to provide a statement about his friend's actions. But the real story was already written in the faces of the watching crowd, the moment when prejudice met preparedness, and dignity won without a single blow being struck. The security team moved forward with professional efficiency, their dark uniforms creating a stark contrast against the ceremonial red of the guard's attire. Detective Lisa Morrison, a veteran of the Parliamentary Protective Service, took immediate control of the situation. Her experienced eyes took in every detail: the now docile Rottweiler, the fuming Maxwell Andrews, and Sergeant David Okafor's composed stance. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard as the drama entered its next phase. "Sir, step away from the dog," Morrison directed Maxwell, her tone leaving no room for argument. Two officers flanked him, their presence both a warning and a promise. Maxwell's face had turned an alarming shade of red, his expensive suit now wrinkled from the tension of the confrontation. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered, trying to summon his boardroom authority. "Do you know who I am? That man interfered with my private property?" James Porter stepped forward, his face lined with resolve. The time for loyalty to old friendships had passed. "I saw everything, Detective," he said, holding up his phone. "I have video of Max threatening the guard and ordering his dog to attack. I've already sent copies to my email and cloud storage." Maxwell's head snapped around, betrayal warring with rage on his face. "You wouldn't dare," he hissed, but the words carried more desperation than threat now. David maintained his professional composure, though he had shifted to ensure Zeus remained calm during the security team's approach. The dog sat obediently at his feet, showing none of the aggressive behavior from moments before. Several observers in the crowd noticed and commented on the transformation, their phones still recording every moment. The story was already spreading across social media, with initial clips of the confrontation generating thousands of views. Sarah Chen approached Detective Morrison, Her ceremonial stance relaxed slightly to engage in official communication. "Ma'am, we have multiple camera angles from our security feeds, including audio." Sergeant Okafor was fully within protocol throughout the incident. She glanced at David with professional admiration. His handling of the situation prevented what could have been a serious security breach. The crowd had grown larger, held back by additional security personnel who had arrived to establish a proper perimeter. Among the onlookers, the elderly veteran who had witnessed the entire confrontation spoke quietly to his wife. "Reminds me of our K9 units in Kosovo," he said, nodding appreciatively. That guard knew exactly what he was doing, saved the dog as much as anyone else. Detective Morrison turned to David, her notepad ready. "Sergeant, we'll need your statement. I understand you have specialized experience with military working dogs." David nodded, his voice steady as he maintained subtle control over Zeus through small gestures that only an experienced handler would notice. "Yes, ma'am. 3 years with the Special Forces K9 unit in Afghanistan. The dog's training signature is military grade, but it's been modified with unauthorized protocols." Maxwell tried to interject, but Morrison silenced him with a raised hand. "Sir, you're facing serious charges. Assault with a trained animal, hate-motivated breach of peace, and based on what I'm seeing, possible violations of prohibited dog training regulations." She turned to one of her officers. "Contact the SPCA. We'll need their K9 behavioral unit to evaluate the dog." The morning had grown warmer, but a cool breeze still carried the scent of autumn leaves across the courtyard. Tourists continued to photograph the scene, their excited whispers creating a background hum of discussion. Several news vans had arrived, their crews setting up cameras at the perimeter established by security. This wasn't just a local incident anymore. It was becoming a story about dignity in the face of hatred, about expertise overcoming prejudice. James Porter approached David, his expression haunted by the morning's events. "I should have done something sooner," he said quietly. "I've watched Max change over the years, become more bitter, more hateful. I just never thought he'd go this far." David met his gaze with understanding. "Sometimes people show us who they really are when they think they have power over others. The important thing is what we choose to do with that knowledge." The security team had begun taking statements from witnesses, their notepads filling with accounts of the incident. The elderly veteran insisted on speaking with Detective Morrison personally, his military bearing evident as he described the technical precision of David's response. "That wasn't just good training," he explained. "That was experience. The kind you only get from real situations, real consequences." Sarah Chen coordinated with the other ceremonial guards to maintain their posts while accommodating the security investigation. The Parliament building's daily operations had to continue, even as this drama unfolded in its shadow. She caught David's eye and gave him a subtle nod of respect. They had trained for various scenarios, but this incident would likely become a case study in their future preparation protocols. Zeus remained calm under David's guidance, showing no signs of the aggressive behavior that had made him a weapon in Maxwell's hands. A specialized veterinarian had arrived to assess the dog, her experienced eyes noting the mixture of professional training and problematic conditioning. "This animal has potential," she commented to Detective Morrison. "With proper rehabilitation, he could be repurposed for positive work. The foundation training is actually quite good. It's the overlay of aggressive conditioning that's the problem." The next few hours unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of procedure and protocol. Inside the Parliament building's security office, David sat across from Detective Morrison, his ceremonial uniform still immaculate despite the morning's events. The small room hummed with activity as officers processed statements and reviewed security footage. On a wall-mounted screen, social media clips of the incident played silently, their view counts climbing by the minute. "Walk me through your background with K9 units," Morrison requested, her pen poised above a fresh page. David's response was measured, each word chosen carefully. 3 years with the Special Forces K9 unit, primarily in Kandahar province. We handled everything from threat detection to civilian protection. I specialized in rehabilitation of compromised working dogs. animals that had been trained for aggressive response or mishandled by insurgent forces. Outside the office, Maxwell Andrews sat in a separate interview room, his lawyer having arrived in a flurry of expensive suits and legal terminology. The gravity of his situation was finally beginning to sink in. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing. Messages from the investment firm's board members, news outlets seeking comment, and increasingly concerned family members. His carefully constructed world was unraveling thread by thread. Sarah Chen appeared in the doorway of David's interview room, her expression professional but concerned. "Sir, you might want to see this." She handed Detective Morrison a tablet displaying several social media posts. The incident had gone viral, with multiple angles showing David's expert handling of the situation. But more significantly, other videos were emerging. Previous incidents involving Maxwell Andrews and his dog, instances of harassment that had gone unreported. "This isn't looking like an isolated incident," Morrison noted, scrolling through the footage. "We're seeing a pattern of behavior." She turned to David. "In your professional opinion, how long would it take to train a dog for this kind of targeted aggression?" David leaned forward, his expertise evident in his detailed response. "Military-grade training takes months of consistent work. But this kind of negative conditioning, training a dog to respond aggressively to specific types of people, that's a longer process. It's also illegal under several Canadian statutes." James Porter had remained at the scene, providing additional details to investigating officers. His face showed the strain of someone whose worldview had been dramatically altered. "I've known Max since prep school," he explained to a junior officer. "He always had opinions, but this past year something changed. He started attending these private meetings talking about preserving traditions and taking back control." The officer's pen moved quickly across his notepad, documenting what could be valuable background information. The veterinarian who had examined Zeus provided her preliminary report. "The dog shows signs of extensive professional training overlaid with aggressive conditioning," she explained to Detective Morrison. "The baseline work is military grade, but someone has deliberately modified the training to create attack responses to specific triggers, racial, cultural, and social cues that would normally be neutral to a working dog." She paused, checking her notes. "This kind of modification is complex and expensive. It would require specialized facilities and trainers willing to ignore ethical guidelines." David listened to the veterinarian's assessment, his mind connecting dots from his military experience. He had seen similar cases in Afghanistan. Professional military dogs that had been captured and reconditioned by insurgent forces. The parallel was disturbing, the same techniques being used here in Ottawa, at the heart of Canadian democracy. "Detective," he interjected, "in my experience, this kind of specialized training usually involves a network, not just a single trainer." Morrison nodded, her expression grim. "We're already looking into that angle. Mr. Andrews's financial records show substantial payments to a training facility outside the city. The RCMP is preparing to execute a search warrant." She turned to Sarah. "We'll need to review security protocols. If this is part of a larger operation targeting government installations..." The implications hung heavy in the air. What had begun as a single incident of racial harassment was expanding into something potentially more sinister. The autumn sun had reached its zenith outside, casting stark shadows through the office windows. In the distance, the ceremonial changing of the guard continued. The ancient ritual a reminder of the traditions David had sworn to protect, not the twisted version Maxwell Andrews championed, but the true values of service and dedication to all Canadians. Zeus had been temporarily placed in the care of the SPCA's specialized handling unit. The veterinarian was optimistic about his rehabilitation prospects. "The foundation training is still there," she explained. "With proper work, we can help him unlearn the aggressive responses and return to his original working dog protocols." She smiled slightly. "Actually, Sergeant Okafor, given your experience, we might want to consult with you on the rehabilitation process." David's phone buzzed with a message from his former commanding officer in Afghanistan. "Saw the videos. Textbook handling, son. Some skills never fade." The simple praise meant more than any official commendation. He had maintained his composure, protected civilians, and even saved the dog from its own training, all while upholding the dignity of his position as a ceremonial guard. Evening had settled over Ottawa, the Parliament building's Gothic architecture casting long shadows across the grounds. In the RCMP's Tactical Operations Center, Detective Morrison stood before a wall of evidence photos and documents, her experienced eyes scanning the connections they'd uncovered throughout the day. David sat nearby, having been asked to consult given his unique expertise with military K-9 training. The investigation had expanded far beyond a single incident of racial harassment. "Look at these training records," Morrison said, pointing to a series of documents recovered from Maxwell's phone. Multiple payments to something called Heritage Guardian Training Services. But when we dig deeper, there's no official registration for this company. She tapped another document. The money moves through 3 different shell companies before reaching its final destination. David leaned forward, studying the training protocols they'd recovered. "These are modified military procedures," he observed, his finger tracing the familiar patterns hidden within the corrupted training methods. Someone with actual military K-9 experience designed these, but they've been altered to trigger aggressive responses based on specific characteristics: race, culture, even the way someone walks or stands. The perversion of legitimate training techniques made his stomach turn. Sarah Chen entered the room, carrying a fresh stack of files. "We've got more," she announced, spreading photos across the table. "Remember those private meetings Porter mentioned? We've identified the location, an old industrial property outside the city. Satellite images show regular gatherings, vehicles registered to some interesting people." The photos revealed a compound with training areas, obstacle courses, and what appeared to be kennels. "This isn't just about one man's prejudice," Morrison concluded, connecting new strings on the evidence board. Andrews was part of something larger, a network of wealthy individuals using trained dogs as weapons of intimidation. She turned to David, documenting what could be valuable background information. The veterinarian who had examined Zeus provided her preliminary report. "The dog shows signs of extensive professional training overlaid with aggressive conditioning," she explained to Detective Morrison. "The baseline work is military grade, but someone has deliberately modified the training to create attack responses to specific triggers, racial, cultural, and social cues that would normally be neutral to a working dog." She paused, checking her notes. "This kind of modification is complex and expensive. It would require specialized facilities and trainers willing to ignore ethical guidelines." David listened to the veterinarian's assessment, his mind connecting dots from his military experience. He had seen similar cases in Afghanistan. Professional military dogs that had been captured and reconditioned by insurgent forces. The parallel was disturbing, the same techniques being used here in Ottawa, at the heart of Canadian democracy. "Detective," he interjected, "in my experience, this kind of specialized training usually involves a network, not just a single trainer." Morrison nodded, her expression grim. "We're already looking into that angle. Mr. Andrews' financial records show substantial payments to a training facility outside the city. The RCMP is preparing to execute a search warrant." She turned to Sarah. "We'll need to review security protocols. If this is part of a larger operation targeting government installations..." The implications hung heavy in the air. What had begun as a single incident of racial harassment was expanding into something potentially more sinister. The autumn sun had reached its zenith outside, casting stark shadows through the office windows. In the distance, the ceremonial changing of the guard continued. The ancient ritual a reminder of the traditions David had sworn to protect, not the twisted version Maxwell Andrews championed, but the true values of service and dedication to all Canadians. Zeus had been temporarily placed in the care of the SPCA's Specialized Handling Unit. The veterinarian was optimistic about his rehabilitation prospects. "The foundation training is still there," she explained. "With proper work, we can help him unlearn the aggressive responses and return to his original working dog protocols." She smiled slightly. "Actually, Sergeant Okafor, given your experience, we might want to consult with you on the rehabilitation process." David's phone buzzed with a message from his former commanding officer in Afghanistan. "Saw the videos. Textbook handling, son. Some skills never fade. The simple praise meant more than any official commendation. He had maintained his composure, protected civilians, and even saved the dog from its own training, all while upholding the dignity of his position as a ceremonial guard. Evening had settled over Ottawa, the Parliament building's Gothic architecture casting long shadows across the grounds. In the RCMP's Tactical Operations Center, Detective Morrison stood before a wall of evidence photos and documents, her experienced eyes scanning the connections they'd uncovered throughout the day. David sat nearby, having been asked to consult given his unique expertise with military K-9 training. The investigation had expanded far beyond a single incident of racial harassment. "Look at these training records," Morrison said, pointing to a series of documents recovered from Maxwell's phone. Multiple payments to something called Heritage Guardian Training Services. But when we dig deeper, there's no official registration for this company. She tapped another document. The money moves through 3 different shell companies before reaching its final destination. David leaned forward, studying the training protocols they'd recovered. "These are modified military procedures," he observed, his finger tracing the familiar patterns hidden within the corrupted training methods. Someone with actual military K-9 experience designed these, but they've been altered to trigger aggressive responses based on specific characteristics: race, culture, even the way someone walks or stands. The perversion of legitimate training techniques made his stomach turn. Sarah Chen entered the room, carrying a fresh stack of files. "We've got more," she announced, spreading photos across the table. "Remember those private meetings Porter mentioned? We've identified the location, an old industrial property outside the city. Satellite images show regular gatherings, vehicles registered to some interesting people." The photos revealed a compound with training areas, obstacle courses, and what appeared to be kennels. "This isn't just about one man's prejudice," Morrison concluded, connecting new strings on the evidence board. Andrews was part of something larger, a network of wealthy individuals using trained dogs as weapons of intimidation. She turned to David. He was an investor. There are similar contributions from at least 24 high-profile individuals across Canada. The names on the screen read like a who's who of old money and corporate power. "They're not just training dogs," David observed, studying the compound's layout on the monitors. "Look at these obstacle courses, the urban warfare simulation areas. They're creating a private security force." His military experience helped him read between the lines of what they were seeing. The dogs are just one component. They're training handlers too, teaching them how to use the animals as weapons while maintaining plausible deniability. Morrison nodded grimly. "Perfect for intimidation. A dog attack can be dismissed as an unfortunate accident, the owner claiming they lost control." She turned to another screen showing Maxwell Andrews in his holding cell, his expensive suit now wrinkled, his arrogance replaced by nervous tension. Andrews cracked during his last interview, admitted the group calls themselves the Heritage Protection Initiative, claims it's just about preserving traditional values. "Team Bravo reporting," the radio crackled. "Document cache located in the main office, multiple hard drives, training manuals, client files." The tactical team's helmet cameras showed shelves of professionally bound manuals and folders. David caught glimpses of familiar military training protocols mixed with unauthorized modifications. James Porter had provided more context throughout the evening, his statement painting a picture of gradual radicalization. "The group started as private social gatherings," he explained to investigators. "Exclusive dinners, members-only events. But the tone changed over the past year. They started talking about taking action, about using their resources to protect their interests. Max became obsessed with their message. The veterinarian's analysis of Zeus had opened another disturbing avenue of investigation. The training modifications we're seeing require sophisticated knowledge of canine psychology," she reported. "They're taking normally balanced dogs and systematically programming them to respond with aggression to specific triggers, racial, cultural, even social class indicators. It's like brainwashing with 4 legs." David's phone lit up with a message from his former K-9 unit commander. "Similar operations identified in Vancouver and Montreal. military police investigating possible connections to former service members. The network was larger than they'd imagined, with roots in multiple cities and possible links to corrupted military personnel. Sarah Chen approached with another tablet. Social media analysis is showing a pattern. Every major protest or civil rights gathering in the past 6 months has had incidents involving out-of-control dogs, different owners each time, but similar attack patterns. She pulled up video clips showing various confrontations, each bearing the hallmarks of the specialized training they'd uncovered. Team Charlie, basement level secured, the radio announced. Located training documentation and video archives. You're going to want to see this. The helmet cameras revealed a professional recording setup, presumably used to document and refine their training techniques. Morrison immediately dispatched evidence collection teams. The night grew deeper as the investigation expanded. Financial records revealed a complex web of shell companies and private security firms, all connected to the Heritage Protection Initiative. They weren't just training dogs. They were building an infrastructure of intimidation, using wealth and influence to shield their activities from scrutiny. Look at these training progression records, David said, examining documents recovered from the compound. They're starting with legitimate protection dog training, then systematically corrupting it. The dogs are evaluated for specific traits: intelligence, trainability, and aggression potential. The ones that show the most promise are put through additional conditioning phases. His disgust at the perversion of proper military training was evident. Morrison studied the client lists they'd recovered. These people all have access to sensitive locations, government buildings, corporate headquarters, public venues, with trained dogs at their disposal. She left the implication hanging. The potential for coordinated intimidation was staggering. James Porter's voice shook as he provided more details about the group's structure. They compartmentalized everything. Most members only knew their immediate contacts, but Max, he was moving up in the organization. He started talking about Phase 2 recently, about making bigger statements. The phrase Phase 2 had appeared in several recovered documents, though its exact meaning remained unclear. Dawn was breaking over Ottawa as the RCMP's Cyber Crimes Unit made their breakthrough. An encrypted hard drive recovered from the training compound had finally yielded its secrets, and the content sent shockwaves through the command center. Detective Morrison called an emergency briefing, her face tight with concern as she addressed the assembled team. David sat near the front, his ceremonial uniform replaced by civilian clothes, but his military bearing unchanged. Phase 2 isn't just a plan, Morrison announced, pulling up documents on the main screen. It's already in motion. The Heritage Protection Initiative has been positioning trained dogs and handlers at key locations across the country. The screen showed a map of Canada dotted with red markers, each representing a potential threat point. Government buildings, public spaces, cultural centers, anywhere they want to exert control through fear. Sarah Chen stepped forward with additional analysis. The financial records show they've accelerated their timeline. In the past month alone, they've activated dozens of new handler dog teams. She gestured to a series of photographs showing trained Rottweilers, German Shepherds, and Belgian Malinois, all breeds with military working dog pedigrees. They're specifically targeting events related to multiculturalism, immigration, and civil rights. David studied the training protocols they'd uncovered, his expertise allowing him to see the full scope of what they were facing. They've modified standard military K9 commands, he explained. The dogs respond to subtle triggers, specific words, gestures, even the handler's tone of voice. It's designed to maintain plausible deniability, while allowing precise control over when and who they attack. James Porter had provided crucial information about the organization's structure. The leadership calls themselves the Council, he revealed during his latest interview. 12 members, all from old money families or high-level corporate positions. Maxwell was trying to earn a seat. The investigation had identified several council members, but others remained hidden behind layers of legal and financial protection. The veterinarian's ongoing analysis of Zeus had revealed more disturbing details about the training program. The psychological conditioning is incredibly sophisticated, she reported. They're using techniques that combine military precision with targeted aggression. The dogs are trained to appear perfectly normal until specific activation triggers are present. She paused, reviewing her notes. What's particularly concerning is how they're breeding for these traits now, creating a next generation of dogs with an inherited predisposition to their modified protocols. Morrison pulled up surveillance footage from various cities. We've identified at least 30 incidents in the past year that match their operation pattern. Most were dismissed as isolated events, dogs getting loose, owners losing control. But look at the positioning, the timing. The screen showed multiple angles of seemingly random dog attacks, each occurring at politically sensitive moments or during progressive community events. They're creating an atmosphere of fear, David observed, his military training helping him see the strategic pattern. These aren't random attacks. They're calculated demonstrations of power. Each incident sends a message. No place is safe. No one is beyond their reach. His words hung heavy in the briefing room, underscoring the psychological warfare aspect of the operation. Sarah Chen's team had uncovered more about the organization's recruitment process. They target individuals with specific profiles, she explained. Former military or law enforcement with K-9 experience, private security contractors, anyone with the skills to handle their specialized training programs. They offer huge salaries and the promise of being part of an elite force protecting traditional values. The command center's screens displayed more evidence from the compound raid. Training videos showed dogs being conditioned to respond aggressively to specific ethnic groups, cultural dress, even particular accents or languages. The level of detail in their programming was chilling. This was psychological warfare disguised as pet training. We've identified one of their main breeding facilities, Morrison announced, bringing up satellite imagery of a remote property. They're not just training dogs, they're creating bloodlines specifically for this purpose. Multiple generations of selective breeding combined with their modified protocols. The implications were staggering. They were looking at a long-term operation designed to create living weapons. David's former commanding officer had sent more information from military intelligence. Similar programs identified in other countries, the message read. Possible international connections. This goes beyond national borders. The Heritage Protection Initiative appeared to be part of a larger network, sharing techniques and resources with like-minded organizations worldwide. James Porter's voice shook as he described attending one of the group's private meetings. They talked about creating a new order, he recalled, using their influence and resources to reshape society through controlled fear. The dogs were just the start. They have plans for expanding their methods, targeting any group they see as a threat to their version of tradition. The morning sun cast long shadows through the command center's windows as the team processed the scale of what they were facing. This wasn't just about one incident at Parliament Hill anymore. It was about uncovering and stopping a sophisticated network of hatred operating under the guise of private security and dog training. Maxwell Andrews' attack on David had inadvertently exposed a operation years in the making, one that threatened the very fabric of Canadian society. The RCMP's Tactical Operations Center erupted into activity as multiple alerts lit up their monitoring systems. Reports were coming in from across Ottawa. Trained dogs appearing at peaceful protests, civil rights gatherings, and cultural celebrations. The Heritage Protection Initiative was making its move, perhaps sparked by Maxwell Andrews' arrest and the raid on their training compound. Detective Morrison quickly assembled her team, knowing they had to act fast to prevent widespread chaos. They're not even trying to hide anymore, Sarah Chen reported, tracking incidents on the main screen. We've got confirmed sightings at 6 different locations, all matching the training protocols we identified. The map of Ottawa blinked with new alert points, each representing a potential threat to public safety. They're targeting a multicultural festival in Confederation Park, an immigration rights rally at City Hall, and several other gatherings. David studied the pattern of deployments, his military experience allowing him to see the tactical thinking behind it. This isn't random, he observed. They're testing our response capacity, forcing us to spread our resources thin. He pointed to several locations on the map. Look at the positioning. They're creating choke points, limiting escape routes for their targeted groups. Morrison nodded grimly. Agreed, and we've got another problem. She pulled up security camera footage from various sites. Some of these handlers are wearing police or security uniforms. They've infiltrated legitimate security services, making it harder for civilians to know who to trust. The images showed men and women in various official-looking uniforms, each accompanied by highly trained dogs bearing the subtle signs of the initiative's conditioning. The veterinarian who had been working with Zeus rushed into the command center with urgent news. The rehabilitation protocols we developed, they work. We can break their aggressive conditioning, but it takes time we don't have right now. She spread her findings across the table. The dogs are trained to respond to specific ultrasonic signals. The handlers are using hidden devices to trigger attacks while maintaining plausible deniability. James Porter, still providing crucial intelligence, had identified several key council members who were coordinating the operation. They're calling it Demonstration Day, he reported via secure line. They want to show what their network is capable of, create widespread fear to support their agenda. His voice carried the weight of someone who had witnessed the planning of these events, but had been too afraid to speak up earlier. David's phone buzzed with messages from his military contacts. Similar coordinated actions were being reported in other major cities: Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal. The Heritage Protection Initiative had created a national network of handler dog teams, each trained to respond to centralized commands while appearing to act independently. We need to move now, Morrison decided, activating emergency protocols. But we have to be smart about this. These dogs are victims too, trained weapons that can be rehabilitated. We need to neutralize the threats without harming the animals if possible. She turned to David. That's where you come in. You've dealt with this before, in Afghanistan. We need your expertise. Sarah Chen had identified a pattern in the handler communications. They're using a modified military command structure, she explained. Each sector has a lead handler coordinating their teams through encrypted channels. If we can identify and neutralize the sector leads, she let the implication hang in the air. Without central coordination, the individual handler dog teams would be easier to contain. The command center's screens showed more footage from across the city. Families at the multicultural festival were already being herded into defensive positions by the strategic placement of handler teams. At City Hall, protesters were finding their planned march routes blocked by seemingly random dog-walking security personnel. The psychological impact was building, exactly as the initiative had planned. David watched the tactical display, his mind racing through possible solutions. We need to disrupt their command and control structure, he stated, pointing to specific locations. These positions here, they're too perfect for random placement. These are your sector commanders. His experience with military K-9 units helped him recognize the tactical patterns others might miss. Morrison immediately began coordinating with tactical teams. We'll need your help on the ground, she told David. You know their protocols, how to counter their training. We can't risk civilian casualties, and we need to preserve evidence of their operation. The unspoken message was clear. This was their chance to not just stop the immediate threat, but to expose and dismantle the entire network. The veterinarian provided last-minute guidance to the response teams. The dogs will appear normal until given specific signals, she explained. Once triggered, they'll focus completely on their trained targets. But there's a vulnerability in their conditioning. Strong, authorized command voices can override their programming temporarily. It's not permanent, but it could give us the edge we need. Outside the command center, the morning sun illuminated a city on edge. The Heritage Protection Initiative had spent years building toward this moment, creating a hidden network of trained weapons disguised as pets and security animals. They had infiltrated legitimate organizations, positioned their assets strategically, and waited for the perfect moment to demonstrate their power. Now, as their plan unfolded, they faced something they hadn't anticipated. A coordinated response led by someone who understood both their tactics and their training methods. The next few hours would determine not just the safety of Ottawa's citizens, but the future of a shadowy organization that had twisted military expertise into a tool of hatred and fear. The response operation launched with precision across Ottawa. David, now wearing tactical gear over his civilian clothes, moved with an RCMP team toward Confederation Park. The multicultural festival there had become a focal point of the Heritage Protection Initiative's demonstration, with multiple handler dog teams strategically positioned to create an atmosphere of fear. Through his earpiece, he could hear similar teams deploying to other targeted locations across the city. Alpha team in position, Sarah Chen's voice reported through the tactical network. She was coordinating operations from a mobile command post, tracking handler movements through surveillance feeds and social media updates. Confirmed visual on 3 handler dog pairs at the north entrance. They're wearing private security uniforms, but they match the initiative's operational profile. David studied the scene through tactical binoculars. The handlers had positioned themselves carefully, creating overlapping zones of control. Festival attendees, many in traditional cultural dress, were already showing signs of nervousness, unconsciously avoiding certain areas where the dogs were stationed. It was psychological warfare in action, exactly as the training manuals they'd discovered had outlined. Remember, David spoke to his tactical team, these dogs are trained to respond to specific triggers. The handlers will try to maintain deniability. They'll make it look like the dogs are reacting to perceived threats rather than following commands. He adjusted his radio to a secure channel. Watch for subtle hand gestures, body language shifts, or them reaching for their pockets where the ultrasonic devices might be hidden. The veterinarian's voice came through their earpieces, providing last-minute guidance. The dogs will display specific pre-attack indicators. Watch for sudden stillness, focused attention, or subtle changes in ear position. If you can disrupt the handler's control before these signs appear, you can prevent the aggressive response from fully triggering. Morrison's team had deployed to City Hall, where the situation was equally tense. We've identified the sector commander, she reported. Former military dishonorable discharge 3 years ago. He's coordinating at least 5 handler teams around the protest route. Her voice carried the controlled tension of someone managing multiple threats simultaneously. David's team moved through the festival grounds, using the crowds and vendor stalls as cover. He could see families trying to enjoy the celebration, children in traditional outfits, food vendors serving dishes from around the world, musicians preparing for performances. All of it under threat from an organization that saw such diversity as a threat to their twisted version of tradition. Movement at your 2 o'clock. Sarah warned through the radio. Handler is reaching for something. Possible trigger device. David spotted the man, dressed as the event security officer, his hand moving toward his jacket pocket. The German Shepherd at his side was showing the first signs of pre-attack focus, its attention fixing on a group of women in hijabs. David made his decision. Using his military command voice, he called out a standard K9 control phrase, one that would have been part of the dog's original training before the initiative's modifications. The German Shepherd's ears twitched, momentarily confused by the competing authority in David's tone. The handler, startled by the intervention, fumbled with his ultrasonic device. That moment of hesitation was all the tactical team needed. They moved in smoothly, neutralizing the handler while David maintained vocal control of the dog. "Easy, boy," he commanded, using the precise tone and cadence that military working dogs were trained to respect. Down. The German Shepherd, its aggressive conditioning temporarily overridden by deeper training, complied. Similar scenes were playing out across Ottawa. Morrison's team at City Hall had isolated their sector commander, cutting off his ability to coordinate the handler teams. Without central direction, the initiative's carefully planned operation began to show cracks. Some handlers, realizing they'd lost tactical support, attempted to trigger their dogs anyway, but the RCMP teams were ready. "We've got movement at the council level," Sarah reported. "Multiple high-level members attempting to leave the city. Border services have been notified." The operations leadership, seeing their demonstration falling apart, were trying to escape before they could be connected to the plot. James Porter provided crucial real-time intelligence from his position near one of the initiative's emergency rally points. "They're burning documents," he reported via secure line. "Getting rid of training records, membership lists, anything that could identify their network." But it was too late. The RCMP had already gathered substantial evidence from the raided compound and Maxwell's seized devices. David's team continued moving through the festival, identifying and neutralizing handler dog pairs with surgical precision. Each successful intervention required a combination of tactical skill and specialized K9 knowledge, understanding both the military foundation of the dog's training and the psychological triggers the initiative had added. The veterinarian coordinated with animal control units, ensuring each secured dog was properly handled. "We're seeing consistent patterns in their conditioning," she noted. "Once we disrupt the handler's control, the dogs often revert to their basic military training. They can be rehabilitated." It was a reminder that the animals themselves were victims of the initiative's hatred. Through it all, festival attendees began to realize something was happening. The atmosphere of fear the initiative had tried to create was being replaced by one of relief as people saw professional teams efficiently removing threats. Some even recorded videos of David and other handlers calming previously aggressive dogs, demonstrating that expertise and compassion could overcome programmed hatred. 1 week after the coordinated response that had disrupted the Heritage Protection Initiative's demonstration, David stood once again at his post outside Parliament Hill. His ceremonial uniform gleamed in the autumn sunlight, but now tourists looked at him with new understanding. Many recognized him from viral videos showing his expert handling of both Maxwell's dog and the subsequent operation. Some even stopped to take photos with him, their admiration evident in their smiles and respectful comments. In the days following the operation, the full scope of the initiative's network had been exposed. Detective Morrison's investigation had led to dozens of arrests, including 9 members of the Secretive Council. Maxwell Andrews, facing multiple charges, had begun cooperating with authorities, providing detailed information about the organization's structure and operations. His prestigious law firm had quickly distanced itself, issuing public statements condemning his actions. Sarah Chen appeared at the edge of the parade ground, now promoted to lead a new specialized unit focusing on preventing similar organizations from taking root. "The rehabilitation program is showing remarkable success," she reported during her brief visit. "Zeus and 17 other dogs have already responded positively to reconditioning. The veterinary team thinks they can be retrained for legitimate service work." It was a testament to the resilience of the animals, their capacity to unlearn hatred when shown a better way. James Porter had become a key witness, his testimony helping prosecutors understand how the initiative had recruited and radicalized wealthy, influential members of society. "They played on fears," he explained in his deposition. "Fear of change, fear of losing status, fear of a world evolving beyond their control. The dogs were just tools. The real weapon was fear itself." His courage in coming forward had inspired others to break their silence. The investigation had revealed international connections, leading to similar operations being exposed in multiple countries. David's former commanding officer had contacted him with news that military intelligence agencies worldwide were now investigating how their K9 training protocols had been corrupted for civilian misuse. "Your actions didn't just save people in Ottawa," the message read. "You've helped expose a global network of hatred disguised as security services." The veterinarian who had worked with Zeus had established a specialized rehabilitation center, using the knowledge gained from examining the initiative's training methods to help other dogs recover from abuse and mishandling. "We're turning their research around," she explained during a news interview, "using our understanding of how they corrupted these animals to develop better methods for healing them." Zeus himself had become something of a mascot for the program, his transformation from weapon to therapy dog inspiring others. David's role in exposing the network had led to changes in Ceremonial Guard training protocols. New modules were added focusing on identifying and responding to sophisticated threats disguised as ordinary civilian activities. His experience had shown that maintaining tradition didn't mean being helpless in the face of modern threats. Morrison visited Parliament Hill, bringing updates on the ongoing investigation. "We're still uncovering shell companies and front organizations," she reported. "But the network's broken. Without their leadership and training facilities, the remaining members are scattering." The evidence recovered from the compound had proven crucial, providing detailed records of their operations and membership. The multicultural festival that had been targeted had refused to be intimidated. Instead, they had reorganized their event, making it bigger and more inclusive. David had been invited as an honored guest, watching as families from all backgrounds celebrated together, their children playing without fear. It was a powerful reminder of what he had helped protect, not just people's safety, but their right to live and celebrate openly. Parliament had launched an inquiry into how private security services were regulated, aiming to prevent similar organizations from hiding behind legitimate businesses. The investigation had revealed gaps in oversight that the initiative had exploited, leading to calls for reform and stronger vetting procedures. One morning, as David stood his guard post, an elderly veteran approached him. It was the same man who had witnessed the original confrontation with Maxwell. "I served in peacekeeping missions," the veteran said quietly. "Saw how hatred could tear communities apart. What you did, stopping them without losing your own humanity, that's real strength." His words echoed the lesson David had learned in Afghanistan. True power lay not in causing fear, but in protecting others while maintaining one's principles. The autumn winds carried the scent of change as David maintained his vigilant watch over Parliament Hill. The Heritage Protection Initiative had tried to use fear to divide people, but their actions had ultimately brought communities closer together. Their attempt to demonstrate power had instead revealed the strength of those they had targeted, the resilience of a society that refused to be intimidated by hatred. As tourists gathered for the changing of the guard ceremony, David caught glimpses of other ceremonial guards at their posts, each standing a little straighter, a little prouder. They were no longer just symbols of tradition. They were active guardians of the values that tradition was meant to protect. The incident that had begun with one man's hatred had evolved into a powerful reminder that dignity, expertise, and compassion could overcome the darkest attempts at division. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.